ang Pilipino. Dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon.
Hubarin ang takot sa iyong damdamin, ipamalas ang angking galing.
Tumayo mong tapang harapin ng buhay, yakapin ang tagumpay.
Tulungan ang kapwa't bigyang halaga, huwag hatakin ng pababa.
Isipin wag sana ang sarili lang, pakisama't bayanihan.
Subukan nating isulong at ligawan ang
Magandang bukas, ikaw at ako magkasama tayo.
Salubungin ang kinabukasan.
halina't hawakan ang aking kamay, sabay abutin natin ang tagumpay. Patuloy lang tayo sa pagpapantay, iwala sa Diyos ang sandat at gabay.
Bukan natin isulong at ligawan ng magandang bukas. Ikaw at ako magkasama tayo, sabungin ang kinabukasan. Ating lahi,
Good morning and happy weekend to everyone. I'm Ian Alfonso, Senior History Researcher of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. Welcome to the ninth Quincentennial Lecture Series with the theme William Henry Scott at 100, Advancing Philippine Pre-Colonial History with archaeologist Dr. Victor Paz of the UP Diliman Archaeological Studies Program. This online lecture is one of the various online webinars and lectures sponsored by the National Quincentennial Committee in collaboration with the Presidential Communications Operations Office, Radio Television Malacanang, National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Philippine Information Agency, the Department of Education, Department of Foreign Affairs, and the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. We are live on the following Facebook pages: PCOO, RTVM, NHCP, PIA, DepEd, DFA, and NCCA. We would like to thank RTVM Assistant Secretary and Concurrent Acting Executive Director Dennis Wilfred P. Pabalan, Sir Richie Abad, and Edwin Jake Bayawa, who is now the assigned staff of RTVM to us for the untiring support to the historical and cultural education programs of the National Quincentennial Committee and the other cultural agencies. For those who wish to earn a certificate from this lecture, kindly visit and register at portal.nqc.gov.ph. This year, the country is observing the Year of Filipino Pre-Colonial Ancestors by virtue of Proclamation number 1128, Series of 2021. The national government named the National Quincentennial Committee to lead the observance, which is first of its kind in our history as a country. The committee was created in 2018 to spearhead the commemoration of the 500th anniversary of the victory at Mactan, which we had last April 27, and the 500th anniversary of the Philippine part of the first circumnavigation of the world from March 16 to October 28, 2021, respectively. As well as we all know, Magellan and 1521 are two contentious and divisive things in Philippine history. We often see this as the beginning of Philippine history, which is not. We also ascribe to it the contentious phrase, discovery of the Philippines, which for decades, various scholars were combating and rectifying. These two are tantamount to misconceptions that our ancestors were barbaric, uncultured, backward, exotic, and had no level of civilization, which we are now correcting. It is only proper that in commemorating the 500 years or the quincentennials, we are guided by the so-called Filipino point of view, and part of which was shaped by the contributions of one of the giants in Philippine historical research, Dr. William Henry Scott, whose birth centenary coincided this year, actually today, July 10. We would like to acknowledge Dr. Lino Dizon, Commissioner of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, for lobbying before the NHCP Board and the NQC the inclusion of Scott's birth centenary in the official programs of the 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. For those who are curious about our pre-colonial history, please do subscribe to our social media platforms on your screen. Edwin, kindly flash the poster. Yan. If you have Spotify, please do listen to our playlist 500 Years Philippines. It contains songs produced in time for the quincentennial and the year of Filipino pre-colonial ancestors. You may also check various lectures on pre-colonial history and Filipino heroism at portal.nqc.gov.ph. You may actually generate your own certificate there for select lectures therein. We also have YouTube channel to view more our educational videos. Just search on YouTube National Quincentennial Committee. For readings, articles, and various downloadable materials, please visit www.nqc.gov.ph. For you to be updated about our events and the world of our ancestors, follow our Facebook page. It's National Quincentennial Committee. To start, here's a virtual message from the chairperson of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and the executive director of the National Quincentennial Committee, Dr. Rene R. Escalante.
Most of us were taught that Philippine history only began when Magellan arrived in our country in 1521. This is wrong. Because of this, there is a need to intensify our campaign to correct this myth in our life as a nation. It is for this reason that the Philippine government declared year 2021 as the year of Filipino pre-colonial ancestors. Moreover, the 2021 Quincentennial commemorations in the Philippines are rebranded to favor the lands and voice of the Filipinos in revisiting the 500th anniversary of the Philippine part in the first circumnavigation in the world by not calling it as the discovery of the Philippines nor the arrival of Ferdinand Magellan. We have an exciting history before 1521, and we owe a part of our knowledge of the so-called pre-colonial history to an American who is considered a Filipino by heart. I am referring to the Episcopal missionary and historian William Henry Scott, whose centenary is being commemorated today, July 10, 2021. Owing to the pandemic, we cannot unveil our humble gesture to glorify him through a historical marker, courtesy of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. But thanks to our current social media platforms, we can still commemorate his birth centenary through online activities spearheaded by the National Quincentennial Committee, or NQC. The NQC owes to Scott, particularly to his bodies of work, our baseline in grounding our thrusts, perspectives, and programs when we commemorated the victory of the Filipinos in the Battle of Mactan and other related events. He made us realize that a historian can join the League of Archaeologists, Anthropologists, Linguists, and Ethnographers in reconstructing Philippine pre-colonial history. He was brave enough to charter the domain of a historian by entering the world of our ancestors before the Spanish colonization, despite the dearth of historical sources. He was able to find out that our ancestors participated in the Muslim campaign in Sumatra by becoming part of the Muslim Armada of the Ottoman Empire under the command of the governor of Islamic Egypt and the retaking of Malacca from the Portuguese in 1539. And also in Palawan, the surviving crews of the Magellan-Elcano expedition after the Battle of Mactan met a Portuguese-speaking native, and that the young Rahamatanda of Manila had acquainted the said crew of the Magellan expedition in Brunei 500 years ago. And not only that, the Raha had a Spanish-speaking servant whom instructed to assist the expedition in the latter's journey to Maluku, the goal of the Magellan-Elcano expedition. Scott may be American by blood, but he became Filipino in his soul. He was denied Filipino citizenship because of his activism in our country and his stand against U.S. intervention in Philippine affairs. But to the academics, especially to Filipino historians, his contribution was great. Using pre-Hispanic sources like the Chinese records from the Ming Dynasty and the Portuguese accounts before the arrival of the Magellan-Elcano expedition in the Philippine waters years ago, he was able to reconstruct the exciting yet unknown history of our ancestors decades before the Spanish colonization of the Philippines in 1565. May Scott continue to inspire us Filipinos to discover the world of our ancestors. Thank you and keep safe always.
And that's Dr. Rene R. Escalante, Chairperson of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and concurrent Executive Director of the National Quincentennial Committee. I want to reiterate his statement that the 2021 Quincentennial commemorations in the Philippines favor the lens and voice of the Filipino by calling the event 500th anniversary of the Philippine part of the first circumnavigation of the world and not as the discovery of the Philippines nor the arrival of Ferdinand Magellan. He also mentioned how Scott influenced
Mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon. Mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko.
Okay. My apologies. Yes. And Dr. Escalante also mentioned how Scott influenced the 500 years we are commemorating right now. And that Scott may be American, but by and that Scott may be American by birth, but Filipino by heart and soul. And for our main event, this birth centenary of Scott, may I introduce to you our lecturer, Dr. Victor Paz of the University of the Philippines Archaeological Studies Program. Good morning, Dr. Victor Paz.
Good morning, Ian. Morning. Okay. Shall I start?
Yes, sir.
How's my audio? Is my audio clear?
Sir, it's clear.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Quincentennial Commemoration Committee. Thank you, Ian Alfonso, for inviting me to honor an old friend, but much, much older than me. In a way, I am suffering a kind of imposter syndrome because I consider myself extremely junior to speak about William Henry Scott. But as mentioned earlier by Chairman Escalante and Ian, William Henry Scott has contributed so much to the scholarship of Philippine history and archaeology. And back in 2001, Ateneo Press published a festive, a volume to honor his memory. He passed away in 1993. This volume is edited by the eminent Dr. Jesus Peralta, and inside are amazingly important articles in honor of Scott. But if you have a chance to purchase this, it's still available in Ateneo Press. It is worth purchasing it. First, it has a very good background on who the man is. Second, Harold Conklin, one of the best ethnographers, anthropologists who has worked in the Philippines, pieced together a bibliography of everything, almost everything, that William Henry Scott published. So it's a very good reference for historians or people who are teaching history. And because of the web, a lot of them, of these articles are already accessible if you know how to look. And then there are other articles here. And when I look at the list, most of them have passed away, of course. Dr. Peralta is still with us, but I think he's earmarked to give a talk in this series of lectures in the near future. Dr. Shalsita is still with us, and he could have spoken about, given his thoughts about Scotty. That's the nickname of William Henry Scott. And Professor Resildo Mahares is still with us, but I think he already gave a lecture earlier on. So that leaves really a very short list of people that Ian could invite. And somehow he remembered that I knew Scott way back, no? But I only knew William Henry Scott at the tail end of his life, in the last 3 or 4 years of his life, which was tragically cut short in a unfortunate hospital accident that which if he lived longer, he will have written more. He was very prolific. He averaged 6 or 7 articles a year. At one point, he managed to publish 16 articles in 1 year. So that's how prolific the man was in writing. And not only that, I knew about William Henry Scott before I met him, of course, because I was a history major, student of history. And what's important about Scott is when you read him, it's like you're reading a novel. He reads so easily. His words flow. His explanation, the structure of his essays are wonderfully crafted. And so it is always a pleasure to read any of his work. And he writes short articles, long articles, and of course, books. So when I finally met him in 1989, 1990, I was awestruck. He is like what Jess Peralta will mention. He will unannounce, he stays in Sagada, and every month or so, not knowing, no one knows, he will go to Manila and visit the National Museum, query the National Museum about their latest research, discuss major points, interpretations on the data that was gathered. Then he will go to UP and he will hang out with friends at the old Philippine Center for Economic Development Hostel, or PCED. At the patio, that's where I met him. I was a young instructor of history at the history department at UP, and I was hanging out with a lot of other scholars and academics who were in literature, in mathematics, in other sciences, and of course political science. And Scott will join us, and that's where I met him. And so then no one knows he's around. He'll show up, and then like parang bula, no, he will disappear again, and then we all hope the next month he will show up again. So that's the pattern. So for in those times that he stayed for a day or two, perhaps, I try to squeeze as much conversation with him, and of course I try to squeeze as much insights and advice from a man like him. I will always miss if you get a book from him, and that's his signature there. There's this wonderfully bold signature that just says Scotty, and that's how he signs his work. I'll go back to this volume later on, but So he will have amazing insights. So this is a De La Salle University Press publication, quite rare now, but it came out in 1991. No? And when we came out, uh, and of course I had it signed, uh, it blew my mind. Just like every other essay that he wrote, because of his insights, his sharp analytical view, and his grasp of historiography, or the philosophy of how uh, one does history in the 20th century at the time. So uh, then, of course, while I knew him, I knew parallel to my meeting with him uh, that about his life history. Uh, I forgot to mention earlier that to disabuse people of what I'm trying to share here, this is a remembrance of William Henry Scott, and it is a personal view. So this personal view is coming from the perspective of someone who's much, much younger than him, who had the privilege of meeting him and engaging with him, but far from being the closest person or a collaborator in any of his academic work. I am a fan in many ways, and also a productive critic of some of his works. Now, the as mentioned by Chairman Escalante earlier on, when martial law was declared in 1972, he was rounded up with many, many academics from UP. At the time, he was teaching at UP Manila too. And but as the story goes, he was rounded up because the military suspected him to be a communist, because a lot of his students from Sagada um, joined the underground movement. So, but he was not part of the underground. He was a critic of authoritarianism, of course. He was also a critic of bad scholarship. And it was like a comedy of errors in many ways, but he did win his court case, and he was released. But what many people don't know is when he was in prison, he was imprisoned, detained with student activists, such as at that time Butch Dalisay, who is now one of the most eminent poets, writers, editors out there in the field of literature, and with Professor Sius Salazar. He shared a cell with Sius Salazar, and they disagree a lot. No? And 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 Scotty later in years will say in writing that those were the best days of his life, because he was in prison, he was being fed, and he was surrounded by intellectuals, and they had all the time in the world to have a discussion and disagree. And but the beautiful anecdote, I think, that we'll never forget, coming from Z Salazar, is every time their sergeant, the sergeant jailer, gets drunk, he goes into their cell and lectures them about Philippine history. And because they are already in jail, they never stopped, they never corrected the sergeant major, and they listened intently, no, to the soldiers' take of Philippine history. And so that was what they were doing. No? Later on, in the early 90s, Butch Dalisay will write a fictional story called Killing Time in a Warm Place. No, it's a novel. I don't think it's available anymore, but it is based on the experience in detention. And in that novel, there is a version of William Henry Scott there. That's like there's a version of Zeus Salazar and other fellow detainees during those at the peak of martial law, in 1972-73. So was he never left or he never jettisoned this idea of being critical. And I think that is in the very core of the man. That's why he's such a good scholar. He always asks the right questions. He always asks, how do we know what we know? No? Which is a very epistemological question. And from there, he starts now to build what exactly we know. And in the process, he then exposes certain information or generalizations or beliefs that we considered real for a long time. And that's exactly one of the major contributions to the man. I will go to that in more detail later on. It was a very stormy day when the day that Scotty passed. We heard about it from friends almost immediately. There was a storm. They canceled, classes were canceled. And I was in the history department, and we found out about it. There were no more students. Most of the faculty weren't there. And the chairman, or at least, yeah, he was chairman back then, Dr. Jimmy Veneracion told me, now, Vic, we have to make something to honor Scott, and then someone has to go to the wake and present this in behalf of the history department. So I was the one assigned to do that. So we made it from scratch, from cartolina, no, pagpupugay kay William Henry Scott, and then Departamento ng Kasaysayan ng UP, etc., konting Barloloy. So in a stormy night, I went to the chapel of Trinity College, where he was interned. It is ironically or by a coincidence, it is next to the offices of New Day publication, which for those who are followers of Scotty's publications is the number one or the main publishing house that published most of his work. And the reason behind that is because New Day publication is also subsidized by the same church, the Episcopalian Church, where William Henry Scott is a member of. And that's why he also went to St. Luke's Hospital. So they're all together, right, along E. Rodriguez. And when I got there, I thought I was the only one who was surprised. But reading Jess Peralta's account of his visit to the wake, you will then, everyone was surprised who knew him in later life, why he looked like that. You know, for one moment, we all thought, are we in the right wake? No? I had the same reaction, and the reason being, when the mortician saw and prepared William Henry Scott, right, for the wake, he thought that his goatee, his beard, right, was a hospital growth because he was in the hospital for some time. So he shaved it off. So he was clean shaven, and you will not recognize him as Scotty. But then I was there with a lot of his former students from Sagada, who are already prominent and established. And for them, it was a different effect. For them, their Scotty was precisely the unbearded, clean-shaven face who was their mentor, their teacher, and their protector in their formative years, being educated up in Sagada. So it's an interesting perspective. Depending on when you meet the person, you will think that that person has never changed, and it holds true for most of us. How we transform as we age, and how we change our looks as we go through life. So he must have been about 68 or 69 years old when I met him in 1990 or 1989, and he passed away at the age of 72. And now we celebrate his 100th year anniversary since birth. Now, some may ask, but it already has been introduced very well by Ian and Rene, that well, what is the significance or relevance of William Henry Scott in the 21st century? Aside from, some would say, oh, well, it's good to honor a man that we knew, a man who we knew as a scholar. But beyond that, it is important to underscore what he did, which many people now who are young students or later on will be serious scholars in the field of history, in the field of archaeology, may not be aware of that he he opened the doors and windows for the possibilities of asking certain questions that were not even in the purview of the consciousness of many earlier scholars. Let me go into that detail. But as a side note, um, I had some collaboration with William Henry Scott, but very indirectly. We both contributed poetry to a thin volume edited by Arnold Azurin and Gugu de Jesus on poetry by non-poets. So clearly we were non-poets, but he had a couple of poems. I had a couple of poems. Robert Jaworski had a couple of poems. The Princess of Japan had a couple of poems, and we were all uh, tightly packed in this thin volume that was published by Casarilan Press. No? Another very noble press that's not with us anymore, but it published a lot of literary academic works without earning a cent. So the name of that volume in 1991, it's called Heartland, Heartland by Arnold Azurin and Gugu de Jesus. So that's our only collaborative work in print in many ways. Now we were part of that volume. So because of his skill in writing, because in the clarity of his arguments when he does argue, William Henry Scott by far is at the zenith of individuals who were very effective in communicating information coming from archaeology, coming from history, but especially coming from archaeology, which by nature we are a bit dense when we do write because it's full of data of numbers, of measurements, of descriptions that try its darnest not to be poetic. So he will come and gather this information, distill it, polish it, and present it to a larger public. And that is a skill that most of us don't have. I don't have that, but that is what is gripping about reading a William Henry Scott essay. And so his contribution to this, which early on was already part of one of his early publications, published again by New Day Press, is something that it is worth reading. Unfortunately, this publication is out of print now. I think we bought all the spare copies of New Day Press last year or before the pandemic, and it was not much, what was remaining. But on top of this, in other essays, he will go and be critical in the way most archaeologists will synthesize information. Uh, for instance, he like Robert Fox, like uh, Alfredo Evangelista, but as early as the 60s, will question the the interpretation or the hypothesis of Otley Beyer, the Dean of Archaeology or the Practice of Archaeology in the Philippines, when it explains how culture change and transforming the Philippine Islands through waves of migration. Waves of migration as early as 1918, Otley Beyer was already postulating this. It didn't come out of thin air. He was just a good student of the intellectual discourse that came just before he started writing. I'm talking about the Ilustrados, uh, who were writing in Spain, writing in Philippines, who were engaging Ferdinand Blumentritt and Jose Rizal. They already had this mindset of explaining why there's so many types of cultural groups and language in the Philippines by saying that they came in waves of migration that are more or less racially defined. So the Negritos were the first one, no, to be replaced by a certain kind of Malay, to be replaced by another kind of Malay, and so forth. At least about 14 waves. So every cultural change is explained by a trigger that comes from something that was introduced from outside. We are not saying that there are no introductions, on the contrary, no, as you will see later on. But what we are saying is this: cultures can change, uh, and change is constant within cultures, and it can happen with or without external stimuli, right? So to say that this is the trigger or this is the reason is too much. No, it's giving it too much credit, and that is exactly what William Henry Scott is saying, and that's exactly what we are all saying now. We are not saying, in fact, if you look at the literature of our explanations of early history in the Philippines from 4,000 years ago, right, to until the coming of the Spaniards, you will see that it is still prominent. This explanation that when new populations and introduced ideas come in, it transforms societies. Okay, for example, 4,000 years ago, when speakers of a language we now call Austronesian sailed and scattered across the Philippine Islands through the Pacific and up to Madagascar in a span of about 2,000 years or so, they spread their language, and that language became dominant by less than 2,000 years ago, which means that explains why every single Philippine language at the moment being spoken has a mother, what we call the Austronesian language linguistically. So that is still valid, but it is going too far to say that this is the real reason for why cultures change and why our cultures are what they are now. These are just important ingredients, but parallel to at the same time, there are other ingredients that were coming in. The other thing that is very clear, but not explicitly pointed out in the writings of Scott, but later on everyone else did, not everyone, but many people did, including myself, is to try to take out this uh, basic premise that cultures are isolated and develop in isolation before they interact. That's not true anymore in our view. In our view, cultures from the very beginning, from the get go, have always been interacting with other cultures. So there's no such thing as isolation. There are distances, yes, but in the Philippine Islands, in Southeast Asia, because the oceans are highways. Yeah? Scott wasn't the first one to mention that. Uh, Beloria, who is a political scientist and a Filipino into geopolitics, was the first one to argue that, contrary to the thinking of many, oceans are not barriers, but highways. The real barriers are mountains. No, so for those who are from the Visayas here, just look at Leyte, and there's a mountain ridge in the middle, right? To the east, people speak Waray. To the west, people speak Cebuano. Negros is the same thing. And in many, many cases, you will see mountain ranges are geographic barriers that are real for the limiting the interaction or fusion of cultures. But seas are highways. So Wi- William Solheim also argued that way. So he said that in the same way that as soon as modern humans came to this part of the world, they were maritime. And as soon as they were maritime, and that's a highway. So everyone thought that they were the center of the world because people kept on coming to them, and then they travel a lot, and then they interact and then exchange ideas and technology all the time. So this is something that was only possible because in the 60s, um, Scott already had a master's and from Yale, and he was thinking of a topic for a PhD. And he enrolled in the PhD program of history at the UST. So he was at UST, and he was thinking of exactly what topic should he write about. And there was an older man who was a scholar, and he was based at the National Museum. His name was Mauro Garcia. And Mauro Garcia, like the generation older than William Henry Scott, who were already mature uh, in the first half of the 20th century, were of the thinking that we really have to gather and get as much documentation for Philippine history prior to the coming of the Spaniards. And in the turn of the 20th century, as early as the first decade, uh, someone said that he had one or two, and that's Povedano, no? Who was from Panay, and this is the classic then Bornean Datus narrative. But it was presented as if it was a historical document. And then it was accepted by both the American historians, such as Robertson of the Blair and Robertson fame, who was head of the Philippine Library also at the time, and then later on by American and European scholars who were in Philippine studies programs in American universities such as the University of Chicago, and then later on Cornell. Everyone wanted to believe that indeed there were documents that can still be saved, that can just maybe hidden in someone's trunk, baol somewhere, and it will show up and this would enrich our history. So this was there's a man called Marco, and Marco donated documents, sold documents to scholars to the Philippine state too at the time, and they were considered authentic at the time. So by the 1960s, so he kept on doing this up to the 1950s. So this includes the Code of Kalanshao, and other documents, and um, and so Mauro Garcia told William Henry Scott, why don't you look into these documents and carefully study them and answer the question, are these authentic documents? And this was something that was in the personality of William Henry Scott. He was very critical. He likes to scrutinize. He wanted to be an archaeologist, a classical European archaeologist when he was young. He liked mysteries. He liked a good detective story. And this was exactly what was in front of him. A detective story of, finding out who done it, whether the documents were authentic or not. So he went through both the Povedano document, the Marco documents, and he did a classic internal external criticism, and he presented the evidence, right, but in a very eloquent way. So the excerpt of that dissertation is published in this volume, and there it was very clear that none of these documents were genuine historical documents from the 16th century. they were productions, right, of Marco. And in the case of Povedano, this was folklore in Panay, and it was later on codified. But it was not a document that came back from the point of contact with the Spaniards in the 16th century. So you will say that this is big deal. It was a big deal, and the historical community at the time quietly accepted it. But it was not broadcast well enough that this information, textbooks that carried Code of Kalanchao, then Borneo Datu, still treated the information as if it is historical fact, right? The important part there is that when he published this, when he defended his dissertation, his advisor was Horacio de la Costa, the Jesuit Atenean professor, but who was allowed at the time to be the dissertation supervisor at UST. And then in his panel was Teodoro Agoncillo. Yeah? And then Zaide read it too, and everyone accepted his argument. But who will not? If it was crystal clearly argued with supporting evidence why these documents are not historical documents as they were presented. So, as I speak, there are still textbooks and web pages you'll find who still think that these narratives are historical facts. So they are folklore at best, that were codified in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, on top of that, what Scotty did, realizing this, because he had a very open mind. He really wanted to find out what was the truth behind all of this. And later on, he will write and say Mauro Garcia was also very wise. He did not show William Henry Scott that he purchased a bundle of documents that were allegedly written by Padre Burgos of the Gumburso claim. And at that time that he purchased it and he asked Scotty if he's interested to do this research, he knew he did not want William Henry Scott to be tainted by these documents. And why is that? This is the time that Mauro Garcia realized that there's something wrong. The documents were written in very bad Spanish, grammatically wrong, bad constructions, sentence constructions. And he was thinking, this cannot be Burgos. This cannot be Father Burgos. And then he could it be that these are not real documents? And so only after the dissertation was passed that he showed this document or told William Henry Scott that they existed. So it's amazing how these people were believers in a way at the beginning, but faced with the facts, they accepted that, well, no, we were duped. No. And then from hence we adjust. But this is very important because while it destroyed an entire a desire of a lot of people to romanticize the past, to find substantial evidence for a complex cultural for the complex cultural characteristics of our ancestral cultures, it is counterproductive if at the end it is based on fiction, not for history, for people like us who are interested in 21st century historiographical approaches. So the work did us good because then we know that we cannot rely on these documents. So what is the next step? Well, Scotty did not stop there. as mentioned by Chairman Escalante, he was interested. He then went and looked for every single account on the Philippines, and then organized it, analyzed it, and presented it to the public. So a lot of these Chinese accounts were already known in the early 20th century. Austin Craig already did a very good analytical study of what is reliable and what's not reliable out of all these sources. And what Scotty did was just to revive all of that and write it and present it and explain its relevance to the current population at the time. But I will say, because of his language, it is still a good read even up to this time, at the contemporary time. So the other result of that is a reinforcement in the mind and in the interest of William Henry Scott to pursue archaeological information and data. He was never a field archaeologist. As I mentioned earlier, he was interested in archaeology at an early age, but he really didn't pursue it. And, the war broke out. He joined the Navy. He was in the Navy for some time, and then he became a missionary. Only when he stayed in Sagada in the Philippines and then they pursued his graduate work did it that this interest became again central to his intellectual work. And I would say, and it's not written anywhere, that he became really interested in archaeology of the Philippines, of the region again, because I don't know, maybe it's a kind of a subtle guilt that he was responsible in destroying all this, the basis for saying that Philippine society before the coming of the Spaniards was this and that, and it's grand and all of this. So he was hell bent to find more ways of understanding the deeper history of the Philippines, and archaeology was the way to go, the very best way to do it. And that's why he frequented the National Museum. And that's why he was eager in getting hold of new information, of new site reports, synthesizing it, and then trying to present it to the general public in a organized manner. That is something that is very important. A year after the death of William Henry Scott, Barangay was published. This is not archaeological, but the way he did it was to look at all the early accounts, by missionaries, government functionaries about Philippine culture, and then organized the information topically, regionally, and it includes, of course, material culture, which is in the realm of archaeological work. But with a book like this, you can, in one volume, go across all of these manuscripts and know the information that's relevant. And you can even just immediately focus on the topics that you want. Let's say religion, let's say hunting, let's say marriage customs or burial customs, etc. And so he organized all this information in these categories in, again, a narrative, as if a very good person, a very good storyteller is telling you the story, and you can hear his voice. So it is so popular that Ateneo has reprinted it at least 3 times already. And so this is still available in the Ateneo Press webpage. So another important contribution, it has already been established by Ian and by Rene, that his intellectual interest is wide range. He's interested in archaeology, he's interested in languages, he's interested in the labor movement and the history of the labor movement. He's interested in the history of the church in the Philippines. He's interested in the Cordillera as a region. And there in the Cordillera and its cultures as a region, he contributed a lot. So he wrote a lot of essays, he wrote a lot of several books, maybe 3 or 4, but dozens of essays about Cordillera cultures, no? From Sagada to Ifugao to Abra, etc., to Bago. And why is this important now? Well, while I'm interested in that, I think for the purposes of today's talk, in recent times, and he will have celebrated this, colleagues such as Stephen Acabado did a research for his PhD dissertation on the rice terraces of Ifugao. And Scotty was part of this very heated discussion that actually started from the statement of Otley Beyer in reply to the question, how old are the rice terraces in the Cordillera in the Philippines? And what Otley Beyer said, oh, they're 2,000 years old, easily. Okay, based on the technology, the archaeology, not in Ifugao, but in other places, etc. And then other scholars later on said, hold on, we have a problem with that. The American scholar Keesing, who wrote a history of the mountain province, had a problem with it because he, no matter how hard he looked, there were no Spanish accounts passing through Ifugao that mentioned the rice terraces. So there were no rice terraces. So he said the rice terraces were perhaps part during the Spanish period, in late period. Oh, people didn't like that, no? And Bayer didn't like. So there was a big debate, and Scott was here or there, not really position. He wants more evidence, and then other scholars came in, like Maher, who's an archaeologist, and Doug, and who knew William Henry Scott, dug a couple of sites, got radiocarbon dates in Ifugao, and it was around 12th century, 8th century at the earliest, I think. So, oops, it's old enough, but it's not that old. It's not 2,000 years old. Other archaeologists came in, no, and then dated it too. And the last one is Stephen Acabado, who came in and dated some of the terraces and came up with a very young age. And so it became a big issue to say that the rice terraces in the Ifugao region is young, right? And he had an explanation for it. No, they came in. Of course, what the Spaniards saw was a settlement. And why would you make terraces when the flat areas of the river base of the river flood basin is still open, no, for exploitation? So the first families were planting in the relatively flat land. Then conflict with Kalingas and other places created a influx, an exodus of people, of migrants into the area, and because of that, then there was a crisis, or a crisis of land. So people then started terracing the hills, and so and terracing is not that it's very fast to. Contrary to a lot of thinking, there you can create an entire terrace system within less than a lifetime, no? Even quicker, just in a couple of years. Now, the problem with this question, you see, is that it is couched in the wrong way. And that is, first, the thinking that the Ifugao rice terraces are the oldest rice terraces in Luzon. Now, and second, therefore, to date, the rice terraces in the Ifugao region will date the technology of rice terracing in the Philippine Islands. So that's where the mistake is. Rice terracing in the Philippine Islands, as we know archaeologically too, again, Bayer might be correct, no? But we still don't have exact dates for them. But the older terraces are facing Ilocos and La Union in the Bacon region, where Scotty is also in the Sagada region. So those are the places to look for older terracing in the Cordillera. But like Bayer and Arsenio Manuel has pointed out, the Banahaw region, and even up to now, will have terraces. Even up to now, there could be very old terraces there. The the foothills of Antipolo, the Sierra Madre, facing Manila or Quezon City, had remnants of terracing that are still discernible even in 1949, 1950, when scholars noticed it, no? While having a conference in the newly established Diliman campus of UP. So the terracing technology is quite old, but terracing in the Ifugao region is not that old. So that is how we resolve that. But the beauty of this, because like in the tradition of Scott, a question that is at the heart of many beliefs and desires of longing to accept are addressed head on. And then it creates ripples that creates new opportunities to answer new questions. Right? So what happened to this research? It again gave birth to an entire new discourse, a new book that came out again by Acabado and Marlon, who is his local collaborator. And in this book, they are now arguing what is this? They are now arguing that the entire discourse on terracing and antiquity is a product of colonialism. What do they mean? Because uh, of the desire of local communities to engage colonialism and colonial thinking, we are trapped in the game of looking for the oldest, or trying to make everything old. You know? So, uh, so the rice terraces became a subject, right, of this kind of discourse. I will agree with them to a certain extent. For example, Marco, who sold and donated or created, constructed all these fake documents, was just um, was just providing the material for a desire of historians and nationalists uh, who wanted a affirmation of a grand historical past before the Spaniards came. The Americans were doing the same thing. No? They wanted, to go beyond the Spanish period. So, but for a different reason. And then there's a middle ground here, and a middle ground that is very relevant to the celebration of the coming of Magellan's fleet. And the middle ground, which I've argued in a paper that's coming out in a volume, um, you know, uh, Yoyo Villamer wrote a song about it, 1521, Magellan, right, etc. Um, the coming of Magellan is the discovery of the Philippines. Uh, when I looked into the literature in the tradition of William Henry Scott, I realized that the American writers of textbooks never mentioned that Magellan discovered the Philippines. They never used the word discover. But you know who were the ones who used the word discover? It was Benitez. No? It were the first generation of Filipino scholars writing textbook for high school and elementary, and they were the ones who were saying that Magellan discovered the Philippines. Why is that so? My take on this, and even Zaide, for that matter, no? Zaide, who has always been criticized by nationalist historians as being pro-Spanish. In one way, he's right. I mean, Agoncillo and company. But now I am more forgiving that the reason why he looked like this generation of Benitez and company, were they look like pro-Spanish because they were counterpointing the current American colonial setup, which they belong. So the Americans wanted to erase or downplay everything that's Spanish. So what they were doing was for people not to forget the contribution of the Spaniards. And so they were highlighting Magellan discovering the Philippines, which the Americans were downplaying. So this is something that I realized was the dynamics that was going on in the scholarship of the early 20th century. And so, which created now the opening for them to believe that documents are real without really scrutinizing them carefully, without going through internal and external criticism. So that is, again, something that is well within William Henry Scott's interest. He would have been chuckling, smiling, if he found out that the issue of the rice terraces, which he was involved into, is alive and kicking. So the that's an important point. No? Now, the so the work, Scotty, etc. The archaeological work that we do now. So this is now our contribution, is inspired by the work of William Henry Scott. I am an archaeologist, but if you scratch my skin hard enough, underneath is a historian. I am trained and honed in historiography, and I do like, and that is how I appreciate my archaeological research. And that means that I'm interested in anything about the human past. You know? To the point that, like Scotty, I will say that it is important to define what history is and what prehistory is. And that is very fuzzy and confusing in the literature. But I have come up, inspired by William Henry Scott, to say that history is not just based on written documents, as we know, but it is about the entire, everything that we can find out about modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. And so prehistory is about everything that we can find out, right? That we can unearth, we can analyze, we can interpret about ancestral species to humans or parallel species to modern humans, to Homo sapiens sapiens. So for me, that divide is a clear divide that you can use anywhere in the world, because if we keep the old classic definition of what history is based on written documents, then our history isn't less than 500 years. No? And if you becomes more stricter than that, then it will be just maybe in the last 400, 300 years, because we only have a handful of documents to go by. And William Henry Scott would have been, well, he was still alive then, but he didn't have the chance to analyze it. When the Laguna copper plate was discovered and was purchased by the National Museum, that pushed our written history to the 10th century, which is very good. But it's a singular document. We have to find more. And I'm confident that we will find more. No? It is just a matter of hitting it, the right archaeological site along the Laguna Lake. Yeah? So nothing is sacred in terms of interpretation, especially if the interpretation of the past is based on very shaky evidence, right? So we have to be very open to the idea of changing our narratives of the past, because it is more powerful to base narratives on information that everyone can agree that existed and not based on simple faith. And so that is something that is important to underscore. The mind-blowing article for me of William Henry Scott was this short article, not that short, called The Mediterranean Connection, which Chairman Escalante cited in his earlier address. No? And in this article, written in 1989, before I met him, or just before I met him, it blew my mind, because here was an amazing, honest to goodness historical narrative, looking at the footnotes of sources that are known, then pursuing those footnotes, unearthing other documents, nothing to do with the Philippines, but because in the footnotes, you can make connections, and argued that, well, why was Enrique understood, the interpreter of Magellan? why were there people understanding European languages before the coming of Magellan? And the explanation is because after 1492 and the fall of Granada and the sailing of Columbus to look for the New World, Scotty argued that there was a diaspora of Jews and others who were not welcome in the Iberian Peninsula in other parts of the Mediterranean, which then spilled over to India and spilled over to Southeast Asia. So this diaspora can easily be appreciated because maritime technology was developed enough, was constant enough, was vibrant enough for people to sail back and forth in these seas, from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, through the other inner seas in island Southeast Asia. So it opened up the idea of interaction, even and very intense interaction at this time period. Now, one thing that we must remember is that we must not we must remember that the idea that in other textbooks that you read, there's this idea of point of contact, or age of contact. It's a misleading term. As mentioned earlier already by Ian and Rene, the assumption there is that there was no contact before the Spaniards came. Totally false. Contact was there from the get-go. We were never isolated, right? We were always integrated in the larger interaction emporium of cultures that were maritime, were along the coast of the region. And this is something that this early 1989 article of William Henry Scott underscored, which blew the minds of people like me, which then inspired for me to look for evidence of more interaction across deeper time. And as we look, we see a lot, from the distribution of cowrie shells that became money in mainland Southeast Asia, in the southern China, in the central parts of Eurasia, through the exchange of jade that we now can document by the sourcing of the jade itself, right? And the motifs that were used through the spread of pottery, not only tradewear ceramics of high fire quality like the blue and whites that you know of, but more importantly, the earthenware, the ones that we always assume are locally produced. But now we know that even earthenware pots travel far. And we know that by their shape, by the fabric of their make, and by the motifs or the design elements that are included in these pots. And then by the way they bury their dead, by the way they file their teeth, by the way they establish, create motifs, signs, objects that are connected to the way they see the world or their cosmology. All of these now are out there, and as year in, year out, we excavate sites, we accumulate more information. So again, that's thanks to William Henry Scott for inspiring for generations of scholars who later on became archaeologists, but never left the spirit of historical discourse. So the awe that I had for the man while drinking a cold beer, listening to him, asking questions, and one day I did ask him, what's your advice? How come you can write so fast, so well, and so fast? And so he likes to smoke a cheroot. What a cheroot is a small cigar, right? So I asked him, so how come you write so fast and so well, etc.? Writing for you it seems to be so easy. So he chuckles a bit, takes a slow puff of his cheroot, and he said, well, this is how I write. Sit in front of my typewriter, I bang a couple of words, I stand up, I walk around the room, I walk around for minutes and minutes, I go out of the room, then I go back and sit on my typewriter, then I bang a couple of sentences, and then I stand up and I walk around again for minutes and minutes, and that is how I write. So he was saying that he also struggled in writing. I only half believed him, of course, but those words and that anecdote stuck with me, especially nowadays in a pandemic when you try to write and you're struggling to write. And I remember Scotty every time this happens, and it happens every other day, or even more often than that. And in the words of Dr. Jess Peralta in the closing remarks of his introduction to the Festschrift, the influence of Scott cannot be underestimated or cannot be overestimated. He wrote so much. It's out there. He had so many interesting ideas that are still, and insights that are still very relevant today. If it's an insight or an idea, it's worth testing, right? And so in the words of Jess Peralta, Scotty will still be around way after we pass away, from this world, and the next generation of scholars pick up where we left. He will still be relevant because of the quality, the metal, and the volume of his work that's out there. So that is my personal view, my personal take on William Henry Scott on the 100th year since his birth. Thank you very much. If there are any questions or maybe discussion, maybe we can have one. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paz. So, on behalf of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and the National Quincentennial Committee, sir, thank you very much for such a cohesive narrative about your recollection and the intellectual history of William Henry Scott.
It's a personal view, right? It's not a view of
yes, yes. And I personally love how you organize your account of Scott with interconnection. Kahit walang visuals, you made us imagine things. Ano po? And
may visuals naman.
Yes.
Actual.
Yes po. And well, you did not just recount stories about Scott, but shared with us recollections about the recent developments of Philippine studies, like the studies on the Payos or the restorations of the Cordilleras. And thank you for shaping another aspect about the Quincentennial, ano po, sir. And that it could be Filipinos who develop the sense of coloniality in our narrative, like the usage of the phrase "discovery of the Philippines," because all I know, it was the Americans who played on the phrase.
We all thought that way, Only until, again, in the spirit of Scott, you ask the question, why is it so persistent? Why is it so persistent? So my view there really is, it's because even those we thought were pro-Spaniards were also nationalists. And they're the ones who were the ones who propped it up, And then, that's an interesting view. I articulated that more. It's coming out in a volume with Maris Jock, but but that's the exciting part of it.
Yes, thank you very much. Kasi po 1921, 100 years ago, there was this I think 2 year like this one, the 2021, the US insular government of the Philippine Islands commemorated the 400th anniversary, and the phrase was the fourth centenary of the discovery of the Philippines by Ferdinand Magellan. That was the phrase, the branding of the event. And those who led the committee, it was under the Governor General's office. Like the same thing. The committee is under the office of the president. It was Hermenegildo Pardo Tavera who chaired the committee. But You are correct. They were nationalists, yet they embraced the idea of discovery of the Philippines, ano? So
My
it's
thinking
quite
that it's an otherness.
yeah.
So the other here for them were the Americans.
Yes. Mm-mm.
So they were engaging the Americans,
Mm-mm.
and if they had to revive the old one and the dead Spanish, so they were just using that as a tool,
Yes.
to engage the American. But the question there, how conscious were they? I would
Mm-mm.
say I don't know how conscious they were, no? But it's good to look into the old writings of Alip
Mm-mm.
and Zaide to see, maybe. Well, of course, I'm not a scholar of Alip and Zaide, but people can do that. And speaking of, any I don't know if anyone's writing a biography of William Henry Scott, but boy, there's a lot of material to work on, but because he has a good Conklin did a good
Mm.
biography, and there's lots of material. It's a good time to do it while people are still alive who knows him. But most of the people who knew him are dead already. So yeah.
And hopefully we can collect papers out of these lectures. And we would like to invite you, Dr. Paz, to write
Write some.
your stuff about this. We can compile this. Ano po. And actually, we have here the head of the research section of the NHCP. I think she's displeased to rename. Ma'am Christine, kayo po ba yan? And actually, Ma'am Christine Dulnuan, who currently heads the research section of the NHCP, is also from the Cordillera. So malapit sa puso niya si
Yeah.
Scott. And actually, sir, there are numerous questions, but most of the questions are about where can we buy Scott's books.
Well,
So
okay.
yeah.
Very
Actually,
quick. There are
yeah.
only two places.
Yes.
Ateneo Press, which is very active now online, and in fact you can buy Ateneo Press books. No, we have a bookshop here at UP, but because of the pandemic, it's hard to get there. But Ateneo Press, uh, this is still in print. Lots of copies of this,
I have also mine.
and yes, and the Fest Trip. That's this both are worth by. Now, New Day publication
Yes.
still has chips, lots of copies of this.
And also this one.
That is rare already.
Yeah.
So there are very few copies of that there. In fact, none already at New Day. Sinuyod ko na yung New Day. So,
yes.
Wala na to. No? And so New Day was William Henry Scott's primary publisher. So that is his first. His first
patron.
he gives them the right to first refusal.
Yeah.
So he always he supports New Day.
And then they can also search the Facebook pages of Ateneo de Manila University Press and New Day Publishers.
Yeah.
They are active online.
Yes.
So and from time to time they are sharing with their audience the available books. And actually they just posted something, I think, about Scott's book. So maybe we can actually I bought various Scott's books during the Manila International Book Fair in the past years.
Yes.
And one of the books na medyo sabi ko mukhang nag-iba ang tono ni iba naman yung approach, iba naman yung laman ng sinulat ni Scott. Itong ano nga bang title nito? Itong Who Are You, Filipino Youth. So it's a compilation of parang sermons na it's very engaging paano niya binuview ang mga kabataang Pilipino during his time. It was published in 1976. But I bought it just for 10 pesos. Yes. So I bought 20 copies and ginawa kong giveaway sa mga kaibigan ko until ako yung nawala ng kopya. Ngayon, out of print na raw, sabi ng New Day.
Like this, ganyan yan yung mga, he likes to write short things.
Yes, maninipis lang.
And tapos kino-compile niya. Parang mga sundot-sundot lang yan. They're like editorials, op-eds, most of them. But really, yung main work niya is, I would say, yung his dissertation that is mostly published already. this has to be reprinted, I believe na.
Mm.
So, and then updated, pero well, wala na siya. At least yung argument on the Marco manuscripts and Povedano manuscript. It's very good history. If you're a history major, it's must read.
Yes po. Tama po. And going over to the questions, ano po. I invite everyone to kindly post your questions. So for our audience here in the webinar, you may throw in your questions in the chat box. While our friends watching on Facebook, we will try our best to collate your questions. Kindly comment your questions and clarifications in the comment box of the live streaming now. So, Dr. Vic, I think this is quite too much to ask from you, and I hope the NCP and NQC continue generating lectures about this topic. But do you happen know, sir, why or how did UST choose the panel of Scott? Kasi di ba parang hindi ba kaya ng UST na mga taga-faculty niya yung mag-panel ng dissertation niya? And then kinuha niya pa mismo sila Agoncillo, Zapra, Zaide, Foronda, Horacio de la Costa.
Well, si Horacio de la Costa ang advisor niya.
Okay po. Pero hindi po siya UST, Doc.
Hindi, Ateneo si Horacio.
Ateneo po siya, no? Oo.
I think I also don't know the answer. No, someone from UST of that period might know in the late 60s. But I would say that the spirit is very simple in the spirit of high-level academic quality. I think because Scott was also not young anymore when he did his PhD. I think they were open to, okay, who can advise you for this, right? And so name it, so then we will support it. I think ganun naging attitude, which is a noble attitude of UST at that time. And then with the panel, it's always you fill in the panel with the people that you think are the best to examine you. And so to get Agoncillo on board, kasi kung si Agoncillo si Agoncillo very influential in those days, and of course his textbook was read. So it's important that they are part of the process, so that wala nang question sa legitimacy of the historiography. And they kept quiet because they could not say anything, and because it was solid work. So I think I would have done the same thing. If someone wants a topic and the topic I am not capable of advising the person well, then I will co-advise it with someone who is, and then the panel will always be someone or populated by people who can really ask, read and find and ask questions, or that are relevant to the topic. So ganoon naman.
So PhD history po ang kinuha ni
I think so.
Scott,
It was
So ganoon na pala katanda ang program ng history sa UST, ano? And was there a precedent to it, sir? May ganoon na po bang composition ng panel na
I don't know sa but in many places that happens. Usually you have an external examiner, so you get someone from outside the institution to be part of the panel. We practice that. We get an external examiner to be part of the panel. So may mga panelists, and then meron kang critique. Yung critique yung pinakamalapit sa topic mo that can really scrutinize your work before it gets defended. So yeah, that's quite a parang standards practice naman.
At saka hindi biro yung argument ni Scott.
Mabigat.
Babaguhin niya yung textbook.
At yun ang nangyari, but it took a long time before textbooks were
adjusted.
It took a long time. I remember as a elementary student, Kodo Kalanshaw was still historical. At Aten Borneo Datus, still considered historical.
Kahit nung elementary kami, 1990s, sinuturo pa rin sa amin yung 10
as historical fact, right?
Yes.
Rather than as, this was a old view, di ba? Hindi ganyan, same with Otti Bayer's Waves of Migration.
Migration. Ako, naabutan pa
Hindi
rin
siya
namin.
tinuturo as if, this as a cautionary note, di ba? Tinuturo as if this is the explanation, di ba? For culture change. Yes, unfortunately, ganon. Mabagal talaga ang transmission of information and knowledge to a larger. Kasi iba yung gumagawa ng textbook, iba yung gumagawa ng basic research. So, kunyari, NHCP has a big role to play because first, yung tradition nyo of reprinting classics, no? Napakahalaga no, yung printing primary sources, no? And then making it available, cheap, no? And then second, yun na nga, no? You can disseminate information parallel to the school system. And then, of course, the school system can use your material to teach, especially in the, further away from the centers of like the big cities.
Thank you very much, Doc. And was there any chance Scott applied for Filipino citizenship, Doc?
I think there was. Weren't you the one who was saying it? But he was denied. One criticism about Scotty by that he never really learned to speak Filipino. He could speak a bit of Ilocano, di ba? Could understand Filipino a bit, pero not as well as he understood and spoke Chinese. So that was one criticism of the man, but it doesn't. Again, it doesn't dampen the contribution he had in the scholarship. Definitely, he read Spanish. There's no doubt about that, and that's why he can do this.
Yes, he heavily utilized the dictionaries and vocabularios.
Yes, ginamit. Oh, di ba? He explained his methodology doon, He used all the vocabularios and then he compares. And this is before internet and translation. So mano-mano yun. And I don't think he was really using research assistants too much. He was just doing it himself. And well, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience and have you been to his place in Sagada?
Not yet.
It's a very
supposedly today we will be there, but Sagada is still not open to non-Sagada residents.
If you go to the web, you will see his cottage, and that's exactly what it is. And then they try to maintain it that way and open his library to people to use. So meron naman siya, he has a fairly, a humble library there. And when he died, they cut the pine tree in front, the big one, and made that his coffin. So in the case, ginawang coffin, and he's buried just in the hill, cemetery next, quite close to.
With a very humble tombstone.
Oh, gano'n lang, simple cross. There are pictures in the web too.
Yes,
I haven't been there for some time, but of course I went to see it because I never met him in Sagada, and I always meet him here at UP in the PCED. That's very useful. And he's always dressed the same way, like in the pictures, so always with white shirt or in a maong vest, parang ganon. And always smoking a churro. Smoking churro.
Is his library open to the public even after his death?
Yes, it was, but I don't know now kasi may sino ba yung matikas Sagada na mga grandchildren na or children and grandchildren of people that he taught, so the long needs, for example. And they were telling me that I think nagkaroon sila ng problema dahil may nananakaw or may nawawala. Nawawala mga libro.
Pero meron pa po kaya doon mga unfinished studies na supposedly papublish?
Alam ko, maganda yun. That's a good question. But as soon when he died, 2 articles came out posthumously. Ibig sabihin, nasa pipeline na. And the barangay came out after.
Yes. And I think the barangay in the forward of Ateneo. It was an unfinished book.
Yes.
Yes. And yeah. And then was it right, Doc, that Scott was the only American the only American citizen teaching at UP back then? Was he the one? Was he the one?
Let's not forget that in the before the war, it was quite common to have American teachers in UP. Then after the war, there were still several. Then to mention, of course, Otley Bayer, and then but by the 60s there were very few already, but there were still some. And in fact, Scott was an issue in the forward, in the preface of Professor Salamanca, who was the dean of the extension program at UP. Because when UP moved to Diliman, UP Manila became just an extension of UP Diliman. So hindi siya independent, no? And it had a dean, no? And so he starts by saying, you are doing something illegal in your college. A senior colleague in the history department at UP Diliman warned me early during my deanship of the former UP College Manila, because you're doing something illegal because you are hiring a foreigner called William Henry Scott.
Sino kaya yun?
I can imagine kung sino yun.
Okay.
But it was a height of extreme nationalism. UP then, but now we know that that's a university should not be monocultural. University must be people populated by people, no matter where they come from, who are at their best or or trying their best to push their discipline. So, and that is what makes it a dynamic program or university. So, but syempre, the UP is government. We are all considered civil servants, and in the Constitution, you have to be Filipino to be a civil servant, and that is why we have a hard time. We cannot tenure foreign faculty. So so things are, so you have to go around it and give foreign faculty 3-year contracts, 1-year contracts, but they cannot be tenured in a government agency like UP or any state university like PUP or Palawan State University. Hindi pwede.
And you mentioned earlier one of the lesser known works of Scott, the Mediterranean Connection. So I think Edwin can share with us a poster. We actually uploaded, shared online this article from the Philippine Studies Journal.
Yes.
You can actually download it for free.
Yes.
Philippine Studies democratize most of its contents in the Philippine Studies. And
kinuha ko pa sa JSTOR
JSTOR.
Pero meron na sila ng record.
Yes po.
Very good journal.
Yes, and we are equally grateful to the Ateneo University for democratizing such wonderful article of Philippine Studies. You can search on Google the Mediterranean Connection William Henry Scott PDF. And then it will be, and that search will lead you to the website of Philippine Studies. You can download it on PDF.
Yeah. If there's only one article that you are allowed to read or you can read in your lifetime that was written by William Henry Scott, this article is it. Yan ang advice.
Yes.
Isa lang, kailangan mong mabasa. Kasi kumpleto yan, may historiography, tapos may new data na tapos solid yung argument, malinaw yung pagkasulat. It's a very good article.
At napaka-versatile niya doon dahil
Oo.
Portuguese, Chinese, Spanish
Oo.
accounts yung binabasa niya. And he reconstructed the history of the Philippines
Yeah.
before the Spanish colonization.
Yes.
Yeah. Na meron na pala marunong mag-Espanyol na slave, si Raha Batanda, no? Na isinama niya sa expedition, no? Nagkaroon ng encounter sa Brunei. So, these things are quite odd, ano? Na para pinakinggan mo, parang totoo ba to? Ano? But
Pero
knowing
imagine,
Scott,
sinulat niya na 1998, di ba? 2021 na ngayon. Hindi pa rin alam na maraming tao yan. I mean,
yung alin ho, yung barangay.
hindi, yung ano nga, yung yan mo na yung Mediterranean connection
Okay.
practices niya, no?
Yeah.
But yung data na present niya, no? Parang ang question nga niya diyan, bakit gano'n? Ano yan? Accident lang ba na sa laki-laki ng island Southeast Asia, may enkwentro mo yung isang tao na marunong mag-Portuguese o mag-Kastila, di ba?
Yes.
Ano yung probability nun, di ba? Medyo ridiculous. So it's either ayop sa grabing coincidence, no, na na-meet mo nila yung kaisa-isa, di ba? Or it was more common than expected.
Yes.
Siyempre, pumunta siya sa latter. Now, if it's more common than expected, how come they know, di ba, or they learn these languages? It's because mas common din than expected yung inflow, di ba, ng mga migrants and interactions down the line. And so then he asked the next question, bakit ganon? No? And so he made the expulsion of the fall of Granada as the marker.
Yes.
Kasi nagbago ang Spain sa final victory ng Reconquista. No? They became more intolerant of others. So those others were already Spanish speakers, no? But they were Jews or other
Muslims.
Iba yung itsura nila. They all left Spain. And then they scattered across Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and some of them got to the Southeast Asia, but they don't even have to be there themselves. But it's the interaction.
Yes. Dahil pa natin dapat malaman.
Oh,
yes.
Marami pa yan. Yung maganda sa article na yun is yung insight na you can look at documents nothing to do with your research or to the topic. Pero nasa footnotes.
Yes.
So, read the footnotes. Yan ang lesson. Read the footnotes of what you're reading, and that's where you will see a lot of information that's overlooked by others.
And sometimes uma-under dyan yung tinatawag nating serendipity.
Yes.
Yung hindi mo hinahanap, lumilitaw.
Correct.
And I think Scott was a testament to that,
Yes.
na very serendipitous yung mga nakikita dyan documents kasi napaka-incredible. Gaya nga ng banggit nyo, wala pang Google, wala pang internet noon. Ngayon, napakaswerte natin, na-access natin yung mga documents na yan.
Mas madali na ngayon. Pero yung maganda nga rin, ganun pa rin yung excitement, di ba? The excitement of research. Ang maganda sa Google ay daming pwede, no? Access. But at the same time, madali malunod.
Yes, totoo po yun. At maligaw. Maligaw. Minsan hindi mo na natatapos. Wala ka na natatapos dahil dahil nakikita.
Story of our lives. Di ba?
Yes po. Yun. So, again, we would like to acknowledge one comment in our chat box. Maybe Dr. Vic can answer this. Our last question. Why do you think the Philippine educational system still teach some erroneous, fallacious, contentious historical facts? How do we make it more mainstream? This is from Miss Danica Astilla.
Yeah. Well, the sad fact is, as I mentioned earlier, as a general rule, the basic researcher are not very good at writing textbooks. No? And those who are writing textbooks are not good basic researchers. Iba yung set skill. No? That's one explanation. But that's not all, of course. The next one will be the sociology of textbooks, right? Where certain the textbooks are in many ways traditionally published by some very traditional publishing houses na meron silang in-house work. And Third, kasama dyan, there's a problem with the review system. So sometimes, so if it's not reviewed well, uh, then uh, then there's more chance of oversight, right? At the minimum, maximum, a glaring mistakes. No? So, and then another level is the training of the teachers themselves. In the old days, I will say one reason, one hypothesis I have why the waves of migration of Otley Buyer is still in the consciousness of a lot of people because it's spread not only through the educational system, it spread because it was a Sunday magazine supplement of the evening news in 1953 or 48 for that. And it was in comic form, and that went into the living rooms, of middle class Filipinos from Luzon to Mindanao. It was so popular, they reprinted it again a week after, 2 weeks after. And so, tapos ang ginawa ng maraming pamilya dyan, kinurate yan, tinago yan. No? So, yan ang nababasa ng mga anak nila at sila mismo. And it explains Philippine history, right? In a cavalcade of narratives drawn by Manansala, who was still a young artist then, written by Otley Buyer, para sa early history. Lizzie de Vera wrote the Spanish period to the Commonwealth. So that track, for me, my thinking there is the reason why it is still in our consciousness. No? Way after genetisoning ganyan ng maraming textbooks. And then, yun na nga, kung ang teachers ay hindi updated, then they will follow what they know, di ba? Or what they're exposed to. So, importante dyan ay, kagaya ngayon, no, just to be exposed to more information, and then double check, no, and then to learn and never forget the tools of analysis when looking at information. So you will know what is to be believed and what is a suspect in terms of data, information, and knowledge, diba? So dapat solid yung data, which then you synthesize, you create information out of your data, and then yung knowledge part is much later. So minsan umaabot na lang sa atin knowledge na, no? Without scrutinizing, ano ba basis niyan? The role of a historian and an academic is to always go back to the fundamental, double check the data. When the data changes, everything should change too, right? But ang problema, nag-change na yung data natin, pero yung ating generalization, hindi natin nababago. Take for instance, yun na nga, no? So false na pala yung basis ng Code of Kalantiao, di ba? And false pala yung basis ng 10 Borneo Datu. Pero akala natin totoo pa rin. Pero dapat nung nagbago na to, na-question yung basis niya, everything else should have been revised. So gano'n. No? So a short answer doon ay mahina yung transmission of new information.
And also, siguro, let's maximize or grab every opportunity. Kamukha nitong ganitong mga webinars. So DepEd is one of our partners here. So they are streaming live these lectures on their Facebook page. They have 4 million followers, mostly teachers. So let's grab every opportunity, and you can visit the previous lectures, free lectures of scholars and professionals on portal.nqc.gov.ph. And before we end, we would like to read some insights, Doc Vic. And here in our comment box, from Miss Rodora Agustin, with so much insights about Dr. Scott and his works. Maraming salamat po, Dr. Paz. And from Miss M.L. Belen, Thank you, Dr. Paz, for giving us a glimpse of the man that was William Henry Scott. On Facebook page, we have here pagbati, Sir Vic Paz from Professor Xiao Chua.
Siya.
Yan. Yan. And from Miss Alice Esguerra, I think it should be the National Library of the Philippines that need to collect and keep his collections for preservation, digitization, and access for research and study. Well, it depends to the heirs. Ano mo? Yun. And or maybe the National Historical Commission may acquire it according to Professor Xiao. I hope the National Museum will acquire William Henry Scott collection from Professor Xiao also and preserve it for scholars. Nice lecture, Dr. Victor Paz from Princess May. And I think she's from Gumaka.
Yes, Princess.
Yes. And then greetings to NQC Secretariat and Dr. Paz. Thanks for this symposium. Hoping the New Day Publishers is encouraged to reprint his works from my fellow researcher from NHCP, Mr. Eugenio Agbayani. And yun. Ayan. So love Scott's essays, especially the one on Igorot independence from Mr. Francis James Balagueo.
Right.
Ayan. So ayun po, Dr. Vic, once again, in behalf of the NHCP and NQC, thank you very much for finding time to join us in this humble tribute of the Philippine government to William Henry Scott. And for the information of everyone, this commemorative lecture by Dr. Paz is just an introduction or a prologue to Scott's birth centenary. We have a whole year hence to commemorate his life and legacies. Within the year, a state historical marker from the NHCP will be unveiled at St. Mary's College in Sagada. It just so happened that today we cannot go there to offer a wreath, but hopefully the local government of Sagada can do otherwise. So on July 24, there will be a Scott conference hosted by the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and the paper presenters are Ms. Erlyn Ruth Alcantara, freelance journalist and curator and a friend of William Henry Scott. Of course, Professor Nestor Castro, an anthropologist from UP Diliman. He will talk about William Henry Scott from the perspective of an anthropologist, of anthropologists rather. And of course, Dr. Feliz Noel Rodriguez, who is now based in Kuala Lumpur and working on barangay research work for William Henry Scott. I think Dr. Vic, si Ma'am Noel po ay partly naging involved sa barangay ni Dr. Scott. I don't know if as a research assistant or as part of Ateneo. Binubuo nila yung barangay.
Acknowledgement siya, si Noel.
Si Ma'am Noel.
She used to lecture at Ateneo.
Yes po. Opo. And then we also have Ana Christine Villarba Torres, Dr. Villarba, Dr. Ann. The map, the poem, the church, and William Henry Scott.
Wonderful.
Professor of Language and Literature from UP Baguio. Of course, Ma'am Rowie Bukiren from UP Baguio. She will discuss about William Henry Scott and environmental history. And then a remembrance, a recollections from Mr. Thomas Kilip, former mayor of Sagada, about his acquaintances with Dr. Scott. So, well, as a student of history, one thing I remember about Scott is his approach. We students in the discipline of history call cracks in the parchment curtain. What he meant for parchment curtain were the Spanish documents or archival documents, which are definitely made of parchment paper. And for obvious reason, we do need these Spanish archival documents to have a glimpse of our early history. But of course, these documents are full of biases, like how the early Spaniards in the Philippines called our babaylans as Diablos and Brujas. So Scott taught us to see the cracks, veiling our view to understand and appreciate our ancestors and their worldview. It's idiomatic. He wanted to say, always locate the Filipino and see the Filipino whenever we encounter such biased sources. So once again, I'm Ian Alfonso of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and thank you so much for watching our birth centenary tribute to William Henry Scott. Mag-iingat po tayong lahat.
Thank you for inviting me, and
salamat po ulit, Dr. Vic.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pandirigmang Pilipino. panahon